Why did the radio go silent just before dawn, when every instinct screamed that silence meant death? Captain Alina Hartwell already knew the answer. She just wasn't ready to accept it. The valley below her looked wrong, too still, too exposed. 1,000 Marines scattered across frozen ground, pinned in shallow cover that wouldn't stop what was coming. Frost clung to their gear. Breath rose in white ghosts. Even from 3,000 yards away, Alina could see one of them, a boy really scraping uselessly at permafrost with his entrenching tool. Sparks jumped from metal striking ice. He cried as he dug. He cried because he knew. Then the radio crackled. All sniper teams, execute Protocol 7, withdraw immediately. Protocol 7, emergency abandonment. It meant command had decided the math no longer worked. Assets versus outcome. Probability versus people. It meant survival for those who could leave, and acceptable loss for those who couldn't. Alina didn't answer. Her finger hovered over the transmit button as the order echoed again. She imagined other sniper teams already moving, melting into darkness, choosing careers, families, futures, choosing to live. 40 feet south, separated by jagged stone and fate, her sister lay prone behind another rifle. Lieutenant Meredith Hartwell saw the same valley, the same boy, the same impossible equation. "They'll die," Meredith said finally. Her voice was calm, too calm. "All of them by sunrise." Alina closed her eyes. 12 years in uniform. 12 years of believing discipline saved lives, of trusting that someone higher up saw more than she did, of telling herself that rules existed because people before her had bled to write them. But rules didn't see that boy's shaking hands. "If we stay," Alina whispered, "we lose everything." "If we leave," Meredith replied, "we lose ourselves." The boy in the valley stopped digging. He pulled a photograph from his jacket, looked at it like it was the last thing tethering him to the world. Alina reached down and turned off her radio. The green light died. So did her career. For a moment, there was nothing but wind. Then Meredith clicked her own radio off. 2 sisters, 2 rifles, one choice no one would ever officially acknowledge. They didn't speak again, not because they didn't trust each other, but because they didn't need to. Planning took seconds, overlapping fields of fire, command targets only, create fear, not annihilation. As Meredith slipped away to establish a southern angle, Alina settled behind her scope and remembered her father's voice from years ago. Shooting isn't about bullets, it's about belief. Make them believe they're not alone. Make them believe something unseen is watching. The first enemy officer stepped into view just as the horizon began to gray. Alina breathed. Thought of Arlington, of folded flags, of the boy below who thought no one was coming. She squeezed. The shot cracked the morning open. 3 seconds later, an officer collapsed, throat ruined, authority erased. 2 seconds after that, Meredith fired. Chaos bloomed. And for the first time since the order came down, Alina felt something other than fear. She felt purpose. But purpose, she knew, always came with a price. What kind of childhood prepares 2 sisters to choose disobedience over survival? Alina would have said structure. Meredith would have said absence. Their father raised them on bases and deployments, on field manuals and unspoken expectations. He taught them to shoot when they were 12, not for sport but for precision, not violence, mathematics. Alina learned formulas, wind tables, ballistics. Meredith learned feel, instinct, the moment just before a gust shifted. Their mother left early. Their father never did, until Helmand Province did it for him. The IED that killed him didn't just take a man. It took the illusion that obedience guaranteed safety. At Scout Sniper School, they didn't break. 93% did. They didn't. They excelled in different ways, became known as a complete system split between 2 bodies. Alina followed rules carefully. broke them only after exhausting every alternative. Meredith ignored rules that got people killed. Command liked Alina, trusted her. Command tolerated Meredith. And now, frozen above a dying battalion, those differences collapsed into the same conclusion. The enemy didn't know how many snipers they faced. That was the point. Every officer who stood too tall fell. Every machine gun that threatened the valley went silent. Mortars began walking the ridgeline. Doctrine said relocate. Alina stayed. She fired again and again. Meredith did something Doctrine never would have suggested. She destroyed the mortars themselves. The explosion was violent and final. Sunlight broke over the mountains. The attack that was supposed to begin at dawn never came. Instead, enemy fighters hesitated. Down in the valley, Marines began to realize something impossible was happening. Someone was fighting for them. Alina keyed her radio just once. "You're not alone," she said. The reply came back broken with disbelief. That was when Alina knew there was no undoing this. They had crossed the line, but they had also bought time. When armored vehicles appeared on the eastern horizon, Alina didn't feel relief. She felt resignation. They withdrew before questions could find them. Saving lives was easy. Living with it would be harder. How long can two people outrun the machine they once served? The answer, Alina learned, was measured in terrain and silence. They moved for days through rock and ice, evading search patterns that grew smarter. Helicopters circled where they'd been, not where they were. They rationed food, water, hope. When Meredith was delayed, Alina waited longer than Doctrine ever would have allowed, because some rules mattered more than survival. They argued about disappearing, about turning themselves in, about what kind of legacy obedience really left. Then they found the journal. Another sniper, another valley, another Protocol 7. 400 Marines abandoned. The writer wished someone would be braver. Alina closed the notebook with shaking hands. They weren't special. They were late. From that moment on, running wasn't about escape. It was about making sure the truth didn't die with them. They crossed borders not marked on maps, met people who knew what they'd done and chose silence anyway, traded bullets for passage, held hands in the dark when discovery came inches away. And finally, exhausted and stripped of everything but resolve, they walked into an embassy and said the words no one expects fugitives to say. "We're Marines, and we disobeyed." What happens when the system is forced to look at itself? The interrogations were methodical, cold, exhausting. The questions weren't about what happened. They were about precedent. Alina didn't flinch. Neither did Meredith. Colonel Thorne testified. So did the battalion commander. So did the 19-year-old who had waited to die in frozen dirt. He told the court how he heard shots and realized someone had refused to leave him behind. That was the moment Alina understood something. The system could punish disobedience, but it couldn't erase truth once it was spoken aloud. The verdict came weeks later. They were found guilty. They were also commended. The sentence was lighter than expected. Careers ended. Uniforms surrendered. But 1,000 Marines went home. Protocol 7 was quietly reviewed. No announcements, no apologies. Just chain. Years later, Alina would sometimes wake before dawn, heart racing, hearing phantom radios go silent. She never regretted the choice. Neither did Meredith. Because dignity, she learned, doesn't argue. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it simply acts and lets history catch up later. What kind of childhood prepares someone to disobey an order that saves their life, so they can save the lives of others. Alina Hartwell asked herself that as the bolt slid forward and another round chambered with a quiet, practiced click. The rifle felt like an extension of her breathing now. In, out, stillness. The valley below was waking up to chaos, and yet her mind drifted backward, years away from the ridgeline, to a different kind of silence. Base housing at 29 Palms had always smelled like dust and sun-baked asphalt. Alina remembered learning to ride a bike between rows of identical homes, Meredith running beside her, laughing, always faster, always daring her to keep up. Their world had been measured in deployment calendars and return dates circled in red. Some kids counted birthdays. The Hartwell sisters counted how many sleeps until Dad came home. Clayton Hartwell never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Authority lived in the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he made decisions and lived with them. When their mother left, he didn't explain it. He just adjusted. New routines, earlier mornings, packed lunches with notes written in blocky handwriting that always ended the same way. Stand tall, think clearly, take care of each other. That was the first rule Alina ever learned. The second came the day he took them to the range. They were 12, too young, some would have said. Clayton disagreed. He laid the rifle on the bench like it was something sacred, not dangerous, explained the mechanics, the math, the responsibility. Every shot, he told them, is a decision you can't take back. Alina took that to heart. She memorized numbers, wind tables, distances. She liked knowing why things worked. Meredith, beside her, closed her eyes before firing, feeling the air move across her skin. She trusted what she couldn't explain. Their father saw it immediately. "Don't try to be the same," he said. "You're different for a reason." That lesson stayed with Alina now, years later, as another enemy fighter exposed himself for half a second too long and paid for it. She watched the body drop through her scope, then forced herself not to look again. She didn't count kills. She counted effects. The enemy line was unraveling. Mortar fire had ceased after Meredith's impossible shot, but Alina knew it wouldn't last. The silence felt artificial, like the pause before a storm recalculated its direction. She could hear distant shouting through her scanner, fragments of fear, confusion, commands spoken too loudly by men trying to sound in control. She worked the bolt again. Another memory surfaced, uninvited. The day the knock came. Dress blues at the door. The words delivered carefully, professionally, like glass wrapped in cotton. Improvised explosive device. Helmand Province. Killed instantly. Alina remembered Meredith's knees buckling. Remembered catching her before she hit the floor. Remembered thinking, absurdly, that their father would have hated the way the metals clinked during the funeral service. Too much noise. Too much ceremony. Afterward, alone in a hotel room that smelled of detergent and grief, Meredith had said she was done, that she couldn't do this anymore, that following orders had gotten their father killed, and she wasn't interested in being next. Alina hadn't argued. She just asked one question. "If we quit," she'd said, "who goes instead?" Meredith hadn't answered. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Someone always went. The system didn't stop because you stepped away. It just replaced you with someone else and kept moving. They stayed. They trained harder. They sharpened themselves until grief became discipline. Scout Sniper School broke most candidates slowly. Alina watched it happen from the inside. Men and women who were strong, skilled, confident, reduced to shaking exhaustion by the simple act of crawling for hours through brush, knowing one wrong movement meant failure. Alina survived by treating it like a problem set. Each inch earned. Each breath measured. Meredith survived by refusing to imagine failure. They graduated at the top. Together but separate, always separate. Alina wrote perfect reports. Meredith produced impossible field results. Command tried to decide which was better. They never realized the answer was both. Now, on the ridge, Alina felt the weight of that history settle into her shoulders like a familiar pack. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was continuation. She shifted slightly as a round snapped overhead, the sharp crack echoing off stone. Enemy countersnipers were finally waking up. Late, but not incompetent. She flattened herself further against the rock, waited for the echo to die, then took her time scanning the opposite slope. There, a glint, just a suggestion of glass catching light. She didn't rush the shot, she breathed, adjusted 2 clicks left, 1 down. The glint vanished. Whether she hit flesh or simply forced him to move didn't matter. Suppression was as valuable as death. Fear did more work than bullets. Her scanner picked up new traffic, different cadence, not panic this time, organization. Someone was trying to reassert control. Alina felt a flicker of anxiety twist in her gut. They were buying time, but time always fought back. Ammunition was finite, luck even more so. She wondered where Meredith was now. She couldn't see her, but she could feel her presence like a pressure at the edge of awareness. Somewhere south, her sister was doing what she always did, making decisions based on outcome, not permission. Another shot echoed, Meredith. Good. Down in the valley, Marines were moving differently now. Not scrambling, not freezing. They were repositioning, coordinating, feeding off the energy that something had their backs. Alina saw one of them stand taller, wave others forward, take charge. Leadership returned the moment hope did. Alina swallowed hard. She remembered being ignored once. Years earlier, a briefing room filled with officers talking over her, dismissing her assessment because it complicated the timeline. She sat there, jaw tight, knowing she was right and knowing it wouldn't matter unless something went wrong. Something had gone wrong then, too. She fired again. Another officer fell. Minutes stretched like hours. The sky brightened fully now, sunlight painting the valley in brutal clarity. Smoke drifted. Bodies lay still. The enemy had pulled back from their assault lines, trying to understand how a plan that had been perfect on paper had collapsed under invisible pressure. That was when Alina heard the sound she'd been dreading. Rotors. Not friendly, not yet. She glanced at her watch, too early for the cavalry. These were search birds moving fast, low, aggressive. They weren't looking for Marines. They were looking for her. She didn't move. Doctrine screamed at her to displace, to relocate, to preserve herself. She ignored it. Moving now would fracture the illusion. It would tell the enemy there were limits, edges, vulnerabilities. She stayed. Meredith fired again, closer this time. Alina imagined her sister's face, focused, jaw set, eyes calm in that way that always came just before she did something reckless and brilliant. The helicopters passed overhead, scanning the ridgeline, missing Alina by yards because she had chosen stillness over instinct. When they moved on, Alina allowed herself one slow breath. This couldn't last much longer. And she knew what came after wouldn't feel like victory. When the armored column finally appeared, distant and unmistakable, Alina felt her chest tighten, not with relief, but with the weight of consequence. Help meant questions. Help meant accountability. Help meant the end of this moment where only action mattered. She took one last look through her scope at the valley. At the Marines who would live. At the boy who was no longer digging. Then she began to withdraw. Each movement careful, each step a goodbye to the life she'd built. As she slipped into shadow, Alina felt something unexpected rise beneath the fear. Not pride. Not triumph. Resolve. Whatever came next, investigations, courts, punishment, she would face it the same way she faced wind and distance and impossible shots. Calmly. Deliberately. Standing tall. Because some lessons weren't taught in classrooms or written into protocols. Some were learned the moment you decided who you were willing to be, when no one was watching. And Alina Hartwell had already made that decision. How far can you run before the past stops chasing you and starts guiding your steps instead? The moment Alina Hartwell broke contact, she felt it, that invisible shift, the one no training ever prepared her for, when the rifle went quiet and the mission stopped being about control and became about consequence. She moved downslope slowly, every step measured, every breath kept shallow. The valley behind her was alive now. Engines, voices, the sound of survival returning in pieces. She didn't let herself listen too closely. If she did, she might stop. And stopping was dangerous for her and for Meredith. She keyed her throat mic once, twice. Static. Then Meredith's voice slid through, calm as ever, like this was just another field exercise and not the end of everything they'd built. Southridge compromised, Meredith said. We need to ghost. Alina didn't ask how close the enemy was. Meredith wouldn't be calling if they weren't already inside the margin of error. Rally point, Alina asked. There was a pause, not hesitation, calculation. Grid Echo 7, the dry riverbed. Alina felt a flicker of concern. That was exposed terrain, hard to hide, harder to defend. But Meredith didn't choose places for comfort. She chose them for outcome. Alina adjusted course, sliding into a narrow cut between boulders, letting gravity help her descend faster. Loose stone rattled beneath her boot and her heart spiked, then settled. Nothing followed. No gunfire, no shouts, for now. As she moved, her mind did what it always did in moments like this. It replayed. Not the shots, not the kills. The faces. She saw the battalion commander's expression when the radio had come alive again. Shock first, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to relief. She wondered if he knew, even then, that the order he'd given would haunt him longer than their disobedience would haunt them. Alina didn't hate him. That surprised her. She understood how decisions were made at that level. She studied the doctrine. She sat in the rooms where maps replaced people and probabilities were treated like mercy. Someone always had to be willing to say enough. Today, that someone had been her. The riverbed appeared ahead, a pale scar through dark terrain. Alina slowed, scanned, then slipped down into it, staying low, letting her outline dissolve into shadow. She reached the rendezvous point first. That made her uneasy. Meredith was rarely late. Alina checked her watch, 30 seconds, 60, 90. Her chest tightened. She scanned again, heart pounding now, the calm she'd carried all morning beginning to fracture. She hated this part, the waiting, the not knowing, the space where imagination filled gaps with worst-case outcomes. She remembered another wait, another desert, another dawn. They'd been younger then, still proving themselves. A different operation, but the same silence stretching too long. Meredith had missed a check-in by 2 minutes. Alina had told herself not to panic. Doctrine said 2 minutes meant nothing. When Meredith finally emerged, limping, blood seeping through her sleeve, Alina had felt something crack inside her she never fully repaired. She pressed her back into the riverbank now and forced herself to breathe. In, out. 120 seconds. Then Meredith appeared, sliding into the riverbed with the same controlled urgency as always, rifle steady, expression unreadable. A thin line of blood traced her temple, already drying. "You're hit," Alina said. Meredith shrugged, grazed. Alina wanted to touch her, to check, to be sure. She didn't. There would be time for that later, if later existed. "We're being hunted now," Meredith said quietly. "Not pursued, hunted." Alina nodded. She already felt it. The way the air changed when you stopped being a problem and started being a target. They moved. For hours. Across ridges and through dead ground, skirting villages, avoiding trails. They ditched equipment that weighed them down. Burned notes. smashed anything that could be traced. By the time the sun dipped low again, they were no longer snipers or officers or sisters. They were ghosts. That night they hid beneath an overhang that smelled of dust and old rain. Alina took first watch. Meredith slept, rifle across her chest, breath slow but shallow. She always slept like that now, half present, half ready. Alina watched her sister and felt the familiar mix of emotions twist inside her. Pride, fear, guilt. She wondered if Meredith blamed her for not stopping this sooner, for believing, for too long, that obedience and morality were the same thing. She didn't ask. Some questions were more dangerous than bullets. By the third day, word had reached them, not through official channels, but through the quiet ways information moved when people chose to share it. A shepherd who lingered too long, a trader who asked the wrong question and then apologized for it. 2 female snipers. Unauthorized engagement. Lives saved. Command furious. The story was already mutating. Heroes to some, criminals to others, symbols to people who needed them. Alina hated that most of all. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be right. The fourth night, Meredith finally spoke the thought that had been circling them both like a predator. We can't keep running forever. Alina stared into the darkness. I know. They'll make an example of us. I know. And if we disappear, Meredith trailed off. They'll control the story, Alina finished, and nothing changes. Meredith exhaled slowly. So what do we do? The question hung between them, heavier than any order ever had. Alina thought of their father, of the journal she'd once found tucked into his sea bag, filled not with heroics but with doubts, pages and pages of them, moments he'd questioned whether doing his job well had meant doing the right thing. He never shown that side to anyone. Except somehow to her. We tell the truth, Alina said finally, all of it. Meredith studied her in the low light. That ends us. Alina met her gaze. Maybe, but it gives them something they can't bury. Meredith was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. They didn't plan beyond that. They didn't need to. The decision itself felt like a kind of relief, heavy but clean, like setting down a pack you didn't realize was crushing you. The next days were the hardest. They moved toward borders not marked on their maps, toward places where uniforms meant less than stories. They avoided friendly units as carefully as enemy ones. Every helicopter sound sent adrenaline spiking. Every checkpoint became a calculation. Once hiding beneath a collapsed bridge, Alina shook so badly she thought she might give them away. Meredith noticed, said nothing, just reached over and squeezed her hand, once. It was enough. When they finally stepped into the embassy compound, dust-covered and unarmed, Alina felt smaller than she ever had in combat. The guard stared at them, confused, suspicious, already reaching for protocol. Alina straightened. I'm Captain Alina Hartwell, she said, United States Marine Corps. Meredith stepped forward beside her. We disobeyed an order. Silence followed, the heavy kind. Alina didn't know what would come next. But for the first time since dawn on that ridge, she felt something close to peace. Not because she was safe, but because she had stopped running. And sometimes she realized redemption didn't arrive with forgiveness. Sometimes it arrived with the courage to stand still and let the truth speak for itself. What happens when the noise finally catches up and there's nowhere left to hide from it? Alina Hartwell learned the answer in a room with no windows and a table bolted to the floor. The embassy had felt like sanctuary for exactly 3 minutes, long enough for the adrenaline to drain, long enough for exhaustion to settle into her bones, long enough for doubt to creep in, whispering that maybe this had been a mistake, that maybe silence would have been easier. Then the doors closed. The room smelled faintly of recycled air and coffee that had been left to burn. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and unforgiving. Alina sat straight-backed, hands folded, wearing borrowed civilian clothes that didn't quite fit. Across from her, Meredith leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She looked like she was waiting for a sparring match. The first man to enter didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "You understand why you're here," he said. Alina nodded, "Yes, sir." He slid a folder across the table. It was thick, too thick. Inside were satellite images, audio transcripts, time-stamped firing logs. They're firing logs, every shot accounted for. The system hadn't been blind on that ridge. It had just been slow. "Explain this," the man said, tapping a photograph of the valley. "You were ordered to withdraw at 0500. "Yes, sir." "You did not." "No, sir." Silence stretched, not hostile, analytical, like someone examining a fracture to see how deep it ran. Meredith broke it. "With respect," she said, "we assessed that withdrawal would result in catastrophic loss of friendly forces." The man's eyes flicked to her. "That wasn't your call." "No," Meredith agreed, "but it was our responsibility." Alina felt a flash of anxiety ripple through her. Meredith had never softened her edges for authority. Alina had learned how to speak truth without lighting fires. "We weren't trying to override command," Alina said calmly. "We were trying to preserve life." The man leaned back. "You violated direct orders. You engaged without authorization. You altered the operational outcome of an active theater." Alina met his gaze. "Yes, sir." Another silence, longer this time. Then another officer entered, older. His uniform carried weight without decoration. He studied them quietly, like a man deciding how much truth the room could handle. "Do you know how many Marines were in that valley?" he asked. 1,006, Alina said without hesitation. "How many were projected to survive if you complied?" Alina swallowed. "Fewer than 200. The older officer nodded once. "And how many are alive now?" Alina's throat tightened. "All of them." Something shifted then, not absolution but attention. The questioning went on for hours. Timelines, decisions, alternatives, every moment dissected until Alina could see the ridge in her mind with brutal clarity. She answered everything. So did Meredith. No embellishment, no defense beyond fact. When they were finally released to separate quarters, Alina felt hollowed out, like everything that had kept her upright had been pulled out and placed on the table for inspection. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to distant footsteps. Sleep refused to come. Her mind kept replaying the moment she'd turned off her radio, the click that had changed everything. Was she proud of it? She wasn't sure. She knew she would do it again. Days passed, then weeks. They were flown home quietly. No ceremonies, no press, just careful isolation and an ever-growing stack of interviews. Alina learned that truth moved slowly through institutions, not because people were cruel but because consequences were heavy and no one wanted to be the one holding them. Meredith grew restless, packing, push-ups at odd hours. She hated waiting more than punishment. "They're deciding how to make this hurt less," she said one night. "Not for us, for them." Alina didn't argue. She knew Meredith was right. When the hearing finally came, it was what Alina expected. No courtroom theatrics, no raised voices, just rows of officers, civilians, analysts, faces carefully neutral, a process designed to look at itself without flinching. Alina testified first. She spoke about terrain, about timing, about the delay in air support and the overconfidence in enemy suppression. She spoke carefully, precisely, the way she always had. Then they asked her why she'd stayed. Alina paused. "This wasn't in the reports." "I stayed," she said slowly, Because I couldn't find a version of myself that walked away and still slept afterward. The room was very quiet. Meredith followed. She didn't talk about maps or doctrine. She talked about people, about hearing Marines cry on open comms, about watching medevac windows close while decisions climbed a chain too long to matter in real time. I wasn't trying to be brave, Meredith said. I was trying to be useful. That was when they called the witnesses. The battalion commander went first. He looked older than Alina remembered. His voice cracked when he described realizing his men were still alive because someone had refused to leave. Then they brought in a young Marine. 19, the same boy Alina had watched digging into frozen ground. He stood stiffly, eyes forward, hands shaking just enough to be human. I thought we were dead, he said simply. Then I heard shots, and I knew someone hadn't forgotten us. Alina lowered her eyes. When it was over, no one spoke to them right away. They were escorted out, left to wait in a quiet hallway with chairs bolted to the floor, just like the table had been. Meredith leaned her head back against the wall. Well, she said softly, that's that. Alina felt the familiar ache of uncertainty settle in her chest, the kind she'd always hated most, the kind where you'd done everything you could, and now outcome belonged to someone else. The verdict came days later. Guilty. The word landed heavy, not surprising, still painful. Violation of direct orders, unauthorized engagement. But then came the rest. Commendation for valor under fire. Honorable discharge. No prison, no reduction in rank, no erasure. Alina felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Her uniform would hang in a closet now. Her career, everything she'd built since she was 18, ended not with failure but with refusal. Meredith took it harder, or maybe she took it more honestly. She stared at the letter for a long time before folding it carefully and putting it away. So that's it, she said. Alina nodded, that's it. They walked out together into open air, civilian again, the world wider and more uncertain than it had ever been. Alina didn't know what came next, but she knew something had changed. Not just for them. For the system that would think twice the next time it considered leaving people behind. Because sometimes accountability doesn't arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as acknowledgement. And sometimes the hardest thing an institution can do is admit it survived because someone broke the rules. What do you do when the uniform comes off, but the war does? Alina Hartwell asked herself that question the first morning she woke up without orders to follow. No reveille, no briefing schedule, no radio check, just quiet sunlight filtering through a borrowed apartment window and the unsettling realization that the structure she'd leaned on for most of her life was gone. Meredith was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug she hadn't touched. She stared at nothing, jaw tight, shoulders coiled like she was waiting for impact. You sleep? Alina asked. Meredith shook her head, didn't need to. Alina understood. Sleep had always come easier in hostile terrain than in safety. Danger was honest. Civilian life blurred at the edges, too soft, too unguarded. They tried normal things first. Grocery stores, traffic, people complaining about weather and prices and things that suddenly felt absurdly small. Alina caught herself flinching at sudden noises. Meredith mapped exits everywhere they went. Old habits didn't disappear just because paperwork said they should. At night, Alina dreamed of the ridge. Not the shots, not the chaos. The moment before she turned off the radio. That pause lived in her now, a suspended breath she couldn't quite release. The calls started slowly. Journalists, first, politely phrased requests that felt more like traps. Alina declined them all. She didn't want her story simplified into a headline or twisted into something loud and hollow. Meredith was less patient. They don't want the truth. she said one evening. They want a version that makes them feel brave for watching. Alina didn't disagree. Then came the quieter calls. A retired colonel who said he'd been in a similar valley once. A Gold Star mother who thanked them without saying why. A young lieutenant who admitted, in a shaky voice, that Protocol 7 had scared him more than the enemy ever had. Each conversation left Alina feeling heavier and lighter at the same time, like something she'd carried alone was slowly being distributed. Still, there were days she felt broken. She missed the certainty of purpose, the clarity of knowing exactly where she fit. She missed the language of the field, where decisions were sharp and immediate, not buried in hesitation. One afternoon, standing in line at a post office, Alina suddenly felt overwhelmed. The closeness of strangers, the absence of armor. Her chest tightened, breath catching as if the walls were closing in. Meredith noticed instantly, guided her outside without a word. They stood on the sidewalk until Alina's breathing slowed. "You okay?" Meredith asked quietly. Alina nodded, embarrassed. "I don't know who I am without it." Meredith studied her. "You're the same person who stayed." That helped more than Meredith probably knew. Weeks turned into months. They found work that didn't require explanations. Consulting, training, quiet roles where experience mattered more than reputation. Alina discovered she liked teaching, breaking down complex decisions into something younger minds could carry forward. Sometimes after class, students lingered, asked questions that weren't in the curriculum. "What do you do when orders don't feel right?" Alina never gave a straight answer. She didn't want to hand anyone a rule that could get them killed. Instead, she spoke about judgment, about responsibility, about knowing that obedience and morality weren't always the same, but both required courage. At night, she and Meredith talked more than they ever had before. About their father, about what he would have said. "I think he would have been furious," Meredith said once. Alina smiled faintly. "I think he would have been proud, quietly, then furious." They laughed. It felt good. But the world hadn't forgotten them. A congressional review quietly altered engagement protocols. Language changed. Thresholds tightened. No press release acknowledged why. No names were mentioned. Alina saw it anyway. Change rarely announced itself. One evening a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a folded flag. No note, no explanation. Alina held it for a long time, fingers tracing the sharp creases. She didn't know who had sent it. Maybe someone who'd been there. Maybe someone who hadn't. Meredith watched from the doorway. "You okay?" Alina nodded. "Yeah." She wasn't sure if it was true. The breaking point came unexpectedly. A speaking invitation. Not a conference, not media. A closed room, senior officers, decision makers. They wanted Alina to explain what she'd seen from the ridge. She hesitated. This was different. This wasn't about her story, it was about influence. Meredith didn't push. She never did. "You don't owe them anything," she said. Alina knew that. But she also knew something else. If she stayed silent now, the moment would fade. The system would absorb the shock and revert, the way it always did. She accepted. The room was familiar in all the ways that mattered. The posture, the careful attention, the way authority listened when it felt challenged but not threatened. Alina spoke slowly. She didn't accuse. She described the terrain, the delays, the human cost of abstraction. She talked about what happens when decisions are made too far from consequence, when distance becomes insulation. She talked about the boy in the valley, not as a symbol, but as a person whose life had almost been reduced to a statistic. When she finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. One man stayed after, gray hair, decorated. "I gave that order once," he said quietly. "Years ago, I still think about it." Alina met his gaze. So do I. That was all. When she walked out into the evening air, Alina felt lighter than she had in years. Not healed, not complete, but aligned. Meredith was waiting in the car. "How'd it go?" she asked. Alina smiled softly. "I think they listened." Meredith nodded. "That's all you can do." Driving home, Alina watched the city lights blur past and realized something important. Redemption didn't come from being forgiven. It came from choosing, every day, not to look away from what you'd learned. The war didn't end when the uniform came off. But neither did purpose. Sometimes it just changed shape. And Alina Hartwell was finally learning how to carry it. Not as a burden, but as a quiet responsibility she would honor for the rest of her life. How do you measure a life after the moment that defined it has already passed? Alina Hartwell didn't know the answer. Not at first. Maybe not ever. But she felt the question settle into her bones on an ordinary afternoon, years later, when no one recognized her in the quiet place she now called home. She was standing on a ridge. Not that ridge, not the frozen valley where everything had fractured, but a softer one. Pine trees instead of rock. Wind that carried the smell of earth instead of cordite. Below her, a training range stretched out, dotted with steel targets and young Marines learning how to listen to the world before trying to control it. She wasn't here as an officer. She wasn't here as a hero. She was here as a witness. Alina watched a young woman settle behind a rifle, shoulders tight, breath uneven. The girl reminded her painfully of herself, too careful, too eager to be correct instead of effective. Alina didn't interrupt. She waited. Let the silence do its work. Finally she spoke. "Feel the wind on your cheek," Alina said quietly. "Not the numbers, the moment." The girl adjusted, fired. The shot rang true. Relief flashed across her face, followed by pride. Clean, earned. Alina stepped back, letting the instructor take over. She didn't need to be seen. That had become important to her, knowing when presence mattered and when absence did more good. Meredith was leaning against the railing nearby, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She still carried herself like someone who expected impact at any second, but there was ease there now too. A hard-won truce with the world. "Still can't help yourself," Meredith said, faint amusement in her voice. Alina smiled. "Neither can you." They built this place together, not officially, not loudly. A program nested quietly inside larger institutions. No banners, no press, just space for people, especially women, to learn judgment alongside skill. Not just how to shoot, how to decide. Because Alina had learned the most dangerous moments weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet pauses. The seconds where someone decided to follow a rule instead of a conscience, or vice versa. That night, Alina dreamed again. But the dream had changed. She still stood on the ridge, still felt the weight of the rifle. But now, when the radio went silent, she didn't feel panic. She felt clarity. The boy in the valley looked up, not afraid this time, but calm, as if he already knew the ending. She woke with tears on her face and didn't wipe them away. Some wounds she had learned didn't close. They transformed. The anniversary came quietly. No official recognition. No statements. Just a date Alina and Meredith both noticed without saying so. They drove to a small cemetery outside the city, walked until they found the headstone they always did. Clayton Hartwell. Beloved father, dedicated Marine. Alina knelt, brushing leaves from the stone. Meredith stood behind her, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I used to wonder," Meredith said softly, "if we did what he would have done." Alina considered it. "I don't think he would have wanted us to ask." They stood there a long time. Later at home, Alina opened a drawer she rarely touched. Inside were artifacts of a life that felt distant now. Dog tags, old orders, the folded flag, and the journal she had finally worked up the courage to read cover to cover. Their father had written about fear, about doubt, about moments when he'd followed orders that kept him alive but haunted him anyway. He never condemned the system. He never glorified rebellion. He simply recorded the cost of both. Elena closed the journal gently. She understood him better now than she ever had when he was alive. The message came months later. A Marine, now a sergeant, reached out through the program. He wrote about a patrol that had gone wrong, about an order that felt too clean, too detached from the reality on the ground. He wrote about hesitating, then deciding. Everyone made it back. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he wrote, "but I know I can live with it." Elena read the message twice, then once more. She didn't reply immediately. When she did, it was brief. "You did your job fully." She sat back after sending it, heart heavy and full at the same time. That night, Meredith poured 2 glasses of something Elena rarely drank anymore. "To us," Meredith said. Elena shook her head slightly, lifted her glass anyway. "To them," she said, "all of them." They drank in silence. Years passed. The story faded into classified archives and half-remembered anecdotes told in quiet corners. Names were omitted, details blurred, but the impact remained, embedded in doctrine revisions, in hesitation where there used to be certainty, in questions asked before lives were written off. Elena aged into herself. She stopped needing to justify the choice she'd made on that ridge. She stopped replaying alternatives that no longer existed. She accepted that some people would always believe she was wrong. That was fine. She hadn't done it to be understood. She'd done it so others could live long enough to disagree. One evening, walking alone at dusk, Elena paused as the wind shifted across the trees. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She could still hear it if she wanted to. The click of a radio going dead. The sound of a shot breaking dawn. But now, beneath those memories, there was something else. Voices, laughter, lives unfolding in directions she would never see. That was enough. Because sometimes strength doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it looks like 2 sisters lying in the dirt, choosing consequence over comfort. Sometimes it looks like walking away from everything you've earned to protect something you can't explain. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts, and lets the world decide, much later, that it was right all along.